Hello, welcome to another edition of the Ducks Confidential Podcast. As always, I'm James Crepia, joined by Ryan Clark, and we'll be going over the latest Oregon win, and obviously a very significant one for this season, for historical purposes, for the big picture of the program, for the big picture of the season, and most certainly for Dan Lanning, his players, and everything else. The Big Ten championship game win over Penn State, which immediately punched the ticket to the Rose Bowl, and since they were entering as the only undefeated team and the number one team in the country unanimously in any and every all facet, it made for a very obvious number one seed thereafter, which of course became the formality Sunday afternoon, and the Ducks will await the winner of 8 seed Ohio State and 9 seed Tennessee in the Rose Bowl. Those two teams will play on the 21st, a night game on December the 21st in Columbus, with the winner advancing to play top-seeded Oregon after the way things unfurled across a really highly entertaining and pretty wild at times conference championship weekend, and then for Ohio State's and Tennessee's purposes, a week off, but they will play each other with the season on the line sooner than Oregon will have to concern itself with that level of things. But first and foremost, a championship game win that was just as we drew up, Ryan, as everybody expected. A clash of top 10 defenses turns into the highest scoring championship game in Big Ten history, and one of the, really, if we're going to call it honestly, again, being just totally objective about it, as most certainly we are, but that was truly one of the more just entertaining championship games, not just of this season, but probably in a little while, to be honest. And that goes with, yes, I know that the SEC championship game also went to overtime, and the ACC championship game came down to last-second field goal. I mean, it was a great weekend of football across the sport, but for 45-37, I would hope that no matter how the season ends for either of these teams, and frankly, they could meet in the national championship game with the way they each got their draws. This is one that has the lasting power kind of thing. This is a championship game that could live in a degree of legend, and I'm not sure that it necessarily felt that way to people in time, but in terms of overall performance, particularly from Gabriel and the offense, but for even in a game that you allowed 37 points and nearly 300 yards rushing, there were a few things defensively. Nico Reed specifically, I thought that there was still some highlights, even on a day where, again, statistically, there's some crooked numbers for Oregon's purposes on the defensive side. But Dante Manning and Nico Reed came up with basically not just the interceptions that were what they were, but they were the defensive plays of the game, far and away. I mean, one helps them blow open the lead to the point to where it was insurmountable, and the other one seals it. I mean, that was, again, for a game where neither defense really had a lot to hang their hat on by way of statistics. If it was going to turn into a shootout, one had their defense show up, and the other really didn't.
Yeah, it ended up being the difference in the end, and obviously that Nico Reed play, regardless of what happens in the playoffs, sort of lives on as one of the iconic defensive plays in program history. I mean, it sealed the Big Ten championship in their first year in the Big Ten, so that can't be discounted by any stretch. And I agree with you. I do think that this game had that sort of instant classic feel to it, but I think that folks, especially on the Oregon side, were a little jarred by the fact that it was so unexpected the way that the game went. I'm sure Penn State fans were surprised by everything that played out too, but especially Oregon fans who their defense had been so consistent and had a pretty clear vision of what they thought they needed to do to shut down Penn State. And it turns out that, Penn State came in with an excellent game plan. You got to give credit to everybody on James Franklin's staff for, putting together a great script offensively, for, putting Drew Aller in positions to make plays downfield, and then their running backs and their offensive line combining to really gash Oregon on the ground. Something that no team has really done this year. I mean, Ohio State had good production in that game in stretches. when they came to Autzen, and obviously Ashton Genty did what he did when they played Boise State. But otherwise, Penn State's really the only team to make this Oregon defense look vulnerable this season. And I think that, credit goes to them, and it adds to the, legendary status, as you said, of this game, right? These two great teams, battling in a Big Ten championship that sort of bucks the trends of the conference, bucks the trends of the season for the two individual teams. And Oregon comes out on top and makes history. And, a lot has been made in the recent days, and we'll get into this more later in the podcast about the path for Oregon, but they have proven themselves, regardless of that path, to be the best team in the country with the best shot at winning this national championship. And that is really remarkable and should be something that folks try to absorb and take in a little bit in these next few weeks as they watch the first round games.
We'll certainly drill into basically each phase of it, and then to get into the playoff bit, because obviously at this point we're a couple days removed, so we don't have to go ad nauseum of every which play, most certainly. With the playoff implication and the bracket and all that being the bigger issue. But rather than assessing this, starting with the defense, which I think was the only thing that, boy oh boy, if you go off the real time stock ticker that is social media, I don't know. I just hope the fans had any joy. Because for nearly 4 hours on Saturday night, it really just, in terms of the conversation, it was 4 hours of just tearing down and vitriol and the like regarding the defense, as opposed to, holy cow, this team's just scored 45 points on a top 10 defense and Gabriel's got 4 passing touchdowns. It's one of those things that's harder for fans to really reflect on, and maybe they don't even end up at a point where they reflect on it, where they're like, yeah, the offense did an incredible job and was able to win the game for the team when the defense was struggling as it was, and they should be able to reflect on that and realize that sort of is a indicator of a great team, that yes, their defense had a bad day, but I mean, Dylan Gabriel had one of his best games, if not his best game of the season. Tez Johnson came up huge, had a career high in yards, and Jordan James, had a great game as well. But that's an undeniable, iconic moment in this season that their offense had the performance that it did. Yeah. Look, bottom line, you go into a game like that, and each side has things at the top of their, well, it used to be the chalkboard, but all right, dry erase board. For Oregon's purposes, that is, do not let Tyler Warren beat you. And on the other side of the ball, do not let Abdul Carter and others, to be clear. I mean, he ain't alone, but you start there. defensive player of the year. You start with that guy. Don't let those two guys beat you. Those guys didn't beat them. And conversely, if you're Penn State, it's don't let Dylan Gabriel complete and be as efficient and effective as he is, specifically to Tez Johnson. And then on the other side of the ball, don't let Birch and Uyunglele just bookend and sandwich Drew Allen. That's it. Those are on each side of the ball. Those are, objective one. Do not let these things happen. Well, Oregon succeeded in taking the two biggest players on Penn State's team, and look, there were more weapons, clearly, but the biggest, the alpha dog on each side of the ball, did not beat Oregon. Conversely, Oregon's lead receiver, the most obvious target, who was targeted 12 times and had 11 catches, and the 12th was was a short pass that got deflected. So you can't even say, oh, was it a drop or great coverage? No, it wasn't. It was just a short ball. He goes off in his game MVP. And yeah, on the other side, credit to Penn State's offensive line and its scheme for in a lot of ways, it was not just really well blocked at times, it was scheming out, particularly Mateo. And credit to him in that way. But ultimately, in a game that's decided by one score, those are the things that are going to matter. Your best players, how'd they do, how'd they shine relative to the other teams. One was brighter. So you don't have to overcomplicate it. The scores, whatever. Like you mentioned, whether it's the Ohio State game, whether it's the Boise State game, you're now at a point in the year where all the statistics from the season, throw them out. Because most of them aren't relevant anyway. Who cares what either one of these teams did against Purdue? Who cares? What does it matter?
Yeah, like what is your ability to win a game in the circumstances you find yourself in?
Because you're against anyone with a pulse.
Yeah, you're going to play a great team every step of the way, and that's these games are going to be weird. They're going to be wonky. They're going to buck statistics, and when you're going against a great coach, which I think James Franklin and Dan Lanning went against each other in a sort of chess match way, this sort of thing is going to happen, and these type of games are going to create themselves. It certainly is not the last chance for that to happen this year by any stretch.
We're now dealing with, if it's not by literal to the definition, the top 12, the 12 teams left standing. All right, yeah, there's a couple of teams from either auto bids or at large that are just outside the top 12, but we know what we're getting at here. You're dealing with the 12 best teams in the country. How many of them played another mix of the top 12 teams in the country? Not very many. Oregon played Boise, Ohio State, and Penn State. They played as many teams who are still also otherwise in the field, teams, not just multiple games against one team like Georgia played Texas twice. And Georgia had a brutal schedule, and they also, not just deserving of the two, and et cetera, although now they deal with the injuries, whatever. Those are the numbers that count. How do you do up against other highly talented teams, playoff caliber teams, if you were on the road or neutral site, and individual matchups where your best was tested against their best, and their best was actually good? That's the difference. Like I say, who cares about who decorated the windows best against Purdue or Northwestern or, for the SEC's purposes, Mississippi State, whatever. Those are the stat padding numbers. The ones that matter are against, again, teams who can actually move the needle and be effective against you. And this was, for this performance, for context purposes, and then in the grander picture of things, Dylan Gabriel, for all the just nonsense that he's gotten by way of criticism at times from this fan base and others, earlier in the season especially, with the red zone interceptions early, and which, like, hey, some of it's warranted. The first 2 weeks was a little over the top, to be honest, for some. His touchdown to interception ratio in 4 games against ranked teams today. And this doesn't even include Michigan, whose defense is better and has more talent, just isn't ranked, obviously, since they're 7-5. His touchdown to interception ratio is 11-1. Yeah, that'll do.
Yeah, he shows up in big games every time, and it's a product of his experience, but I mean, you gotta get there. You gotta put yourself in those positions, and you gotta be calm under pressure. And every single time Oregon has faced a big game this season, or a game against a ranked team, he's delivered every time. And that's got to give you so much confidence going into the playoff, knowing that the games are only going to get bigger with each passing round.
Yeah, it's enormous. Those are the things that matter. Like I said, go back and look last year. Similar statistic. Knicks was 10-1. One fewer game in terms of against ranked opponents. Obviously, 2 of them were Washington. And again, you could contextualize and say, well, that Utah wasn't a ranked team, but they went on the road and took care of what they did that game. Right, but point is against AP ranked teams in the end of the season, or where things are at now, as for today, for Gabriel's purposes, 11-1. Again, that'll do. That's just getting into the passing game, not getting into what he did on the ground. Yeah, those are the things that matter, and those are the things to take away from. Those are the things to project out. And for some teams who are in this playoff, as we'll certainly get to, there's not much to project and talk about because they haven't played either any or damn near any ranked teams. So they're the ones who have the hollow and questionable statistics when you're trying to project accordingly. Oregon's the one who's got, like I say, four games of sample size plus a road trip to Michigan against a legitimate defense. Plus, frankly, I know the Wisconsin defense isn't necessarily statistically daunting, but for that particular night, not only how they played, but how they're coached, and the fact that they're coming off a week off and the like, there are other factors that you can put far greater weight into Oregon's abilities, its achievements, than you can for virtually any other team in this playoff field. But we digress. To get to, for the last couple of things on this game specifically, again, offensively, it kind of stands as obvious. They were better than basically in every way. They were bordering at times on unstoppable. The things that stood out to me in terms of not just individual performance, though, was, look, Will Stein has, at various different times now, and this shows you the difference between the game planning week to week versus just going in and being stubborn and the like. And they've been this way for the 2 seasons that Stein. They've game planned accordingly, on both sides of the ball for each opponent. Well, he's shown unbalanced formations before. He's shown tackle over formation before. So you can't act like that's new. But at the rate at which they did it, and coming out with 3 straight runs with Jordan James out of tackle over formations, and then hit, by my count, as I was marking off rewatching the game, 11 times they had run plays out of tackle over. Out of really like 40 designed runs, when you take out the couple of kneel downs and the 1 sack that Gabriel took. That's a really high clip and rate. That's usually something that you see maybe once or twice a game, not maybe 3 or something unconventional. I'm not even going with the additional tackle with Janoris Wilson in there. I'm not even counting those. That's pretty wild. And
yeah, that's like ultimate set the tone with your physicality type of football, which is just like such a testament to what this team has been all season, and their desire to just, and success in punching these other Big Ten teams in the mouth. And this is an elite defense.
Yeah, part of it was because of that elite defense. I get why he was doing it, because you're trying to, when we talk about scheming and the chess match that is, you're trying to scheme around and create different pictures for those 2 bookends at Penn State, starting with Carter, but he ain't alone. And the defensive tackle, you are trying to throw things at these guys that these are future NFL players, every one of them. And it was a different plan compared to what they did against Ohio State. So, yeah, you're going up against multiple top 10 defenses. How did you fare? Well, one of them had the Defensive Player of the Year. And one in particular defensive tackle who's awfully nasty also. And another defensive end who's real good. And they schemed around them with these tackle over deals, with some play action stuff, with some 21 personnel at times. They were throwing a little bit of everything out there, and there was less by way of the vertical passing game compared to the Ohio State game, where they were doing less of tackle over at all. There was a little bit more RPO, a little bit more. And there was more in the vertical passing game against a secondary that hadn't been tested like that and was, a paper tiger in a lot of ways. Whereas this one, either because of the caliber of coverage that Penn State was shown, which credit to them, and it's especially taking Evan Stewart out of the game, but because the secondary was lined up the way it was and covering the way it was for Penn State, Oregon, this goes to the balance of not just this game, but in terms of the rest of the playoff and what makes them as good as they are and so difficult. Because you can have a top 10 defense with all the talent in the world that Ohio State and Penn State have, and several other teams may have in the playoff, in the potential run that they've got ahead of them. And you could take away this weapon or that weapon, but guess what? There's somebody else. And you could take away an explosive receiver, but there's another one. And you could take away both receivers in the vertical passing game and stretching the field that way. And they go, okay, yeah, we have these couple of tight ends we can reintroduce you to. And we'll just throw 3 touchdowns to those guys. Oh, and by the way, if the passing game isn't quite there because one of those guys isn't on the field, then we'll lean on the run game. This team can win not just different ways because at Wisconsin the offense was covering up for things and guys were hurt, and then it could lean on the defense. It comes up with big plays. And in this game, defense has a whale of a time, but the offense comes through. No, the offense can do different things, as we've seen throughout the course of the season. The offense can lean on the ground game, the passing game vertically, the passing game with dink and dunks. They've got that level of balance in all phases. And that makes you, shocker, not just the number one team in the country, that makes you really extremely difficult to defeat. Because when you have that many weapons and that many ways to beat somebody, yeah, you can't just say, take that away. That was the difference between these teams on Saturday night. Oregon said, we got to take away Warren and Carter. And all right, yeah, I'm not telling you they were going to be happy with nearly 300 yards rushing allowed, but when you even drill into that, of the 292, 213 came on 10 out of the 35 carries. And really
explosive plays, exactly what they talked about.
Some massive runs, yeah. And again, credit to Penn State and look, Katron Allen and Nick Singleton, boy, when they get a head full of steam, they are thundering down. But they didn't get a head full of steam, all night. If you take,
it was managing situations like it. Yeah, if you take those away, it's a different ball game in terms of the run game. But like they obviously, bad in Dan Lanning's eyes performance by way of defending the run, but whatever, it's
this time of year.
This time of year, if you have a bad win is a win in these sort of massive games. So he is cognizant of that. He didn't even think about harping on that in the post game. He vaguely alluded to wanting to get better in certain areas. No doy. Like, of course, that's going to be what they focus on these next few weeks. But you spoke about the ability of this offense and the multiple nature of it. I think that because Oregon won games in so many different ways this season because of their defense, that at times the productivity and depth and just pure skill at every position on offense might have gotten lost at times. People were like, well, they only scored 30, or well, they only scored 32 or 35 or whatever. Like, they aren't putting up these gaudy numbers like these other teams, like Alabama playing Mercer or some ridiculous, scheduling, allowing them to put up 56, 63 points, whatever. The reason for that is multiple. It's that, Oregon was able to rely on its defense to win a lot of these games in the regular season. And two, I think a lot of these wins for Oregon came with Will Stein sort of tightening the reins a little bit in the second half, leading to some of these quote unquote third quarter woes, which really weren't woes as much as they were dial backs.
And some bizarre quirks where, again, there were multiple games where scores spanned the third quarter into the opening minutes of the fourth. So how you want to account for that? Good. I mean, whatever.
Yeah, it's a nitpick is the point, right? It's this offense has had these weapons all year. They've been productive. They haven't shown a major flaw all season, save for a couple of like small nitpicks, whether it be the third quarter thing or Dylan Gabriel's red zone decision making, or perhaps putting his receivers in potentially compromising positions. These are all nitpicks of an offense that is incredibly talented, and when it's humming the way it was against an elite Penn State defense, it's remarkable that it's one of the best offenses in the history of this program, including some of those great offenses of the Marcus Mariota era. Like they stand with those groups because of their sheer talent and versatility.
Drill into some of these numbers, again, particularly against ranked teams. And you do get to a point of saying, I'm sorry, but like, what are we even talking about by way of, if there's any criticism at all, what are we talking about? What are we talking about? This team offensively, in 4 games against ranked opponents, is averaging 38 points, which is 4th in the country against ranked teams. But when you contextualize and say, all right, but a couple of those teams, two of the teams in front of them, Notre Dame being one of them, only played one ranked opponent. So if you throw out the ones who only have a 1-game sample, and even just accept those who have 2, yeah, Oregon's then second in that regard. They've scored 152 points in 4 games against ranked opponents, 2 of which have top 10 defenses. I mean, and any criticism there to the offense is like I say, to me, get over it. You understand what you're talking about and whatnot, especially as you start getting projecting forward, and that's where we'll get to now with the playoff field and the like. Because no point in belaboring anything with the championship game that was. It was a heck of a performance on all rounds, and yeah, plenty to fix on defense. But again, really a huge chunk of it was on a select few plays. Just at an even higher clip than the Boise game with Gentry specifically. But in terms of the playoff draw and the like, one, I thought that the bracket did make sense, largely, in terms of SMU getting in over Bama and all that, part of the conjecture and conversation. Ultimately, that Boise got the 3 and that ASU got the 4. The quirk that with the bowl rotation being that Boise gets the Fiesta and ASU is sent all the way to Atlanta. Well, that part I do have to admit, a degree unfortunate for Kenny Dillingham and company, but all right, what are you going to do?
A lot of angry Sun Devils on my Twitter
I'm sure
feed
the
for
ticket sales folks at the Fiesta were also hoping for the reverse at that point, but be that as it may, I understand. And again, it's not a matter for me to agree or disagree, but I understand it and totally get how and where we got to where we got to. I'd say the only thing that would be, and this applies to Oregon's purposes, that is, to a certain extent, whether you want to say it's a quirk, whether you want to say it's good, bad, or otherwise, yeah, the only, not just first round, because there are no rematches in the first round, but the only team that has a potential for a regular season rematch in the second round in the quarters, for that to be your number 1 seed, yeah, it's not great. That's not great. Would I, in that position, would I have potentially configured things in such a way so as to, as long as it didn't completely break seeds and seed lines and upend the table entirely and take up all, put somebody who was in position for a home game and turn them into the road or something like that, would I have potentially have adjusted to better avoid that? Yeah, I would have. I really would have. For one, I was a little surprised that Notre Dame didn't move up more in the seeds. I was surprised that Texas was the 5, only because you get to a point of saying, I'm sorry, but like, who did you beat? I realized that, losing to Georgia twice may not be the end of the world, but especially since the last one was, an overtime game in the conference championship. But yeah, but who did you beat? That being part of it. But ultimately, if the biggest concern that Oregon has by way of the draw is that you could have to play Ohio State, well, you could, but at the same time, prior to seeing the bracket, even ahead of the conference championship games, because it was the matchup that held true from the previous iteration. Not for nothing. After beating Ohio State, you can't spend, if you're an Oregon fan, you can't spend a month and a half, nearly 2 months, dogging how bad they are, particularly after the loss to Michigan, and then turn around and say, oh, but now that we got to play them, they're too daunting an opponent.
Yeah, they're not suddenly a different team than what lost to Michigan.
They still lost a bunch of offensive linemen. They still are getting out-physicaled by multiple opponents every single season in big games. And their head coach was, we're only a couple of weeks removed from their head coach being, basically public enemy number 1 in his own city, in his own state.
Yeah, and it could potentially happen in this game against Tennessee, and to totally discount Tennessee as capable of going into that building and winning, maybe look at the film from that Michigan game, and now those are 2 very different teams, Tennessee and Michigan, but maybe take a look at that and see, oh, yeah, you know what? These guys are vulnerable. This isn't like a semifinal level matchup in the quarters with a team that is I think, on the same level as Oregon, frankly. I don't think that this Ohio State team, is as good now or as they were comparatively to Oregon at that time when they played at Austin, where it was more competitive. It was early in the season.
And injuries. And they lost multiple linemen.
Things were equal. And then that's the biggest thing is they've lost 2 key offensive linemen, and their secondary played better in that game at Autzen than I think they would play in this rematch, given where the 2 teams are at and how they've progressed by way of Oregon's offense and by way of Ohio State's defense.
And that's saying something because their secondary got lit up like a Christmas tree. So that's really saying something.
If I'm Oregon, I'm glad I avoided Notre Dame. If I'm Oregon, I'm honestly glad I avoided a rematch with Penn State a few weeks after having played them, because that's a hard thing in and of itself and probably a tougher challenge than you would face if you're playing Ohio State. And Ohio State isn't penciled in here either, man. Like there's worry and talk and discussion, whether it be online or by people in the professional, sports media world or whatever, about the worry about Ryan Day getting booed if things are going badly, and the sort of unraveling happening before Ohio State even gets to Oregon. So that's not to say that, the Buckeyes couldn't go into the Rose Bowl and beat the Ducks. They could. They have the talent. They have a lot of experience on that roster, and they could put things together. Oregon could have a bad game, and it could work out in their favor. But my God, it's not that piece of this daunting path, I think, is being very overrated by folks in the national media in particular, who are just looking at brand names, but even folks on the more analytical side who are thinking that first step is like the hardest one of this 3-game stretch that could include Ohio State, Texas, and later on Georgia, if Georgia makes it all that way. So
all the way again, for all the other conjecture about the playoff, the bracketing, the format, the auto bids, the seeding, whatever. Again, this will be an off-season long discussion, so we're not here to solve the problem, and nobody asked us. I mean, the whole idea of, we should reseed after the first round. It shouldn't just be designated as such. There's something to be said for that. Here's the other side of that, though. How much of a competitive disadvantage do you want to give the 4 auto bids? Because if you reseed, you don't know who your opponent could be until it happens. I mean, yeah, there's finite options, but you could be preparing for any number of teams versus the teams who are playing. For instance, if you're the 12, you know that if you win, you're playing the 1. So, yeah, you got to pull off the first win to get to the second win, but you can have your advanced staff working on the 1 the entire time. The 1 is not going to sit there thinking, if that miracle happens. No, they're going to be thinking more along the lines of, all right, what about the 9? What about the 8? What about, that kind of thing. So there's no perfect answer to this. We're 1 year's worth of sample size in, and a pretty darn good year at that. I don't think you have to, just because you saw it and you're coming from one perspective doesn't mean I think you have to reinvent the wheel. You've only seen 1 sample size worth of it. And to be honest, I really don't think there's anything wrong with it. I really don't. I just don't. Some of it is the quirks of it in terms of just basic bracketing principles and the auto bids, but you want to keep the auto bids for obvious purposes, to keep the conference championship games. And if you really are going to debate about the merits of conference championship games, then clearly you've never been in charge of a situation where you had a really high value asset and you weren't going to give it up for nothing. So the SEC and Big Ten are not giving away their conference championship games. That's just not happening. So be that all as it may, in terms of Oregon's draw, playing the winner of Ohio State, Tennessee. The other quirk being that, you could then potentially have to play Texas in Dallas, and then ultimately on the other side of the bracket, Georgia and Atlanta. That would be where the draw would be particularly vicious. But again, you can't perfectly design this to so completely carpet ride the number 1 seed for every advantageous situation in the world. You just can't.
Yeah, and then if that was the case, people would complain about that.
Yeah.
So they would say, "Oh, why did they set it up like this if it's just going to end up being 1 and 2 anyway because of how it favors the 1 and 2 seed?"
If you want to make it that geographically obvious, again, then we could throw out the contract bowls, when we will in the future. But for now, we could throw out the contract bowls and say, well, in that case, then Georgia should be playing in Atlanta in the first round. And by the way, they get to do it if they play in the championship. And then everybody would be losing their minds if that was the case. Guess what? There's no bowl game in the Pacific Northwest. There's no bowl destination that's ever going to get added in the Pacific Northwest. Even if they were down in the Bay Area, that wouldn't work. And it was a disaster, by the way, the national championship game that was there, albeit with 2 Southeast teams. And even LA wouldn't be particularly advantageous. So them's the breaks. So be it. As Lanning put it on Sunday, and as he had put it all season when we were talking about 8 games in 8 weeks and other things that are out of their control, they're not using excuses, all that kind of stuff. It's not supposed to be easy. They're not trying to win a championship. You're not trying to look for – this is not trying to pick 3 pincushions. You are trying to win a championship. And at the end of it, look at the teams in the last couple of years who we regard as not just great champions, but potentially some of the greatest teams of all time. 20 Bama had to play in a COVID schedule, 10 SEC conference games before playing in the playoff, and might very well have been the greatest team in college football history. If not, it was 2019 LSU who had to go through the gauntlet that they did, and they didn't care who they played. So if you want to be mentioned in the same sentence, and you want to go undefeated in the first year and do all those things, guess what? You're going to have to beat somebody pretty good. And you may have to beat a couple of teams who are pretty good. Yep, you sure are. Yeah, true story. You're not getting lowly teams anymore. This is just the way it's going to be, man.
It is, and I don't think this program is ducking that or worried about that, and their coach isn't out in the media whining and bemoaning and saying this grievance put us in X situation. He's speaking clearly and with, I think, the right attitude and approach for competitive success and for buy-in, which I think Dan typically does, in that you play who's in front of you and you stand where your feet are and you go against whoever you go against in the playoff. Game plan for them, win the dang game, move on. They'll have a couple of games within the span of a week, likely against elite teams if they're able to advance beyond the Rose Bowl. And then they'll be prepping for another elite team in the national championship, regardless of whether Georgia without its starting quarterback makes it there, or it's Penn State again, or somebody else on that side springs an upset or two. Like it's always been all season for this Oregon team, primarily about mentality and preparation and focus more than anything else, and despite their immense level of talent and experience. And if you think that any of these guys are getting caught up in this national media fervor about, oh my God, their path is so difficult. Gosh, what are they going to do? They should petition the NCAA. This is unfair.
Anyway, but
yeah, exactly. Like all these ridiculous takes that are out there, they fall on empty ears. There's nobody in this Oregon program is truly hearing that or even really allowing it to affect them. They're resting up this week and will continue to recover and prepare over the next several weeks during the holiday season. And they're going to go out there on the Rose Bowl stage on January 1st and be ready for whoever's there. And I have yet to see anything this season that leads me to believe that Oregon would not win that game given its health and given the way that they've played all year long.
Some of the Ducks resting up this week, others taking in the award season that is, particularly Dylan Gabriel. He's already down in Vegas for the Campbell Trophy presentation, was named the Heisman finalist on Monday, really playing out the same way as Bo Nix did the year before. And on the anniversary of his commitment to Oregon, gets to be a Heisman finalist on Monday. Again, he's up for the Campbell Tuesday night. College Football Awards on Thursday night with the Maxwell and O'Brien. He's up for as well, and will be in New York thereafter for the Heisman festivities all weekend and the presentation Saturday night. Obviously, it's either going to go to Hunter or Gentian, and the betting market favorite being Travis Hunter, which is understandable. Cam Ward, also the fourth invite there. And Bryce Betcher getting the Burlsworth Award, the award presented to the top player who started their career as a walk-on. So he gets that Monday night as well. But otherwise, yes, they will reconvene practice-wise shortly thereafter in the portal opening. We'll get to the portal and who else could be there again. We've got time now before the Rose Bowl and who they'll even be playing in those things. We'll get into that more next week. We'll talk about basketball more next week because, frankly, since it's finals week, for Oregon's purposes, there's only one game, the following weekend. I know it's the start of Big Ten play, and we can get back to it, but we're making it about the playoff for this episode. We'll get to basketball and other stuff at a different time. We'll get to the portal at a different time. This time, to keep it about this, and to keep it focused on that subject, and also again as always, you can send your questions in for Ryan's mailbag and the like, whether it's about the playoff seeding. You can send all your grievances to Ryan. He will answer and have all the perfect answers, and he will forward it to Richard Clark and let Ward Manuel, who will no longer be on the playoff committee because he's done with his term, he will forward all of your complaints straight to Ward and let him know how you feel. Remind folks how to send it to you so that you can forward those grievances accordingly, Ryan.
Of course, yeah. The last few weeks we haven't been able to have a mailbag because there have not been enough questions. So if you are listening to this podcast and you have a question about literally anything, even tangentially Ducks related, please email me at rclark@oregonian.com. Ryan T. Clark on Twitter and on Blue Sky. Get on there, folks. It's good for our content purposes to keep things like that rolling, but also to keep the discussion going and broach these topics that folks out there might not be talking about in the national media space that need to be. So, get on.
Ryan just opened the door to all kinds of inquiries about Matt Court because there's anything tangentially related. So there you go. So you can direct all questions about the future of Matt Court to Ryan as well. I get those multiple times a year to this day. Every year, the entire time I've been here, at least 2 or 3 times a year, I get an inquiry about what's going on with Matt Court. I can't even make it up. So, again, direct everything accordingly to Ryan. Remember to like, subscribe, 5-star review, all the like for the podcast as well. So that way it helps us grow, but also helps automatically populate this edition, the Ducks Confidential deal, plus all the other Oregonian sports podcasts automatically into your feed accordingly. So that way you can hear all of us opine and get your blood pressure boiling accordingly on that. And again, we will certainly chat with you again, but way, way, way before the Rose Bowl. And probably before, like I say, even we know whether it's Ohio State or Tennessee, because we've got plenty of time to analyze, again, both basketball, potential playoff matchups, injury updates, and yes, the portal, which we'll get into. We'll probably do the portal more next week once there's a greater feel for who all's in and out, not just from Oregon, but everywhere else, as that continues to populate each and every day here during this week. And then you have a bit of a clearer picture as to where things stand. So we'll get into that and basketball a little bit more next week. But until then, we appreciate you as always, and we bid you adieu.